everybody. I'm Zeus Kerravala, Principal Analyst with ZK Research, and thanks for joining this CX Summit session on avoiding common contact center migration pitfalls. Now, while there are different types of contact center deployment models, we're going to predominantly talk about specifically how when you migrate from on-prem to contact center as a service, also known as CCaaS. And the reason for that is, pre-pandemic, cloud contact center migrations had been strong, but really it's, from what I've seen, it's off the charts now. I think you two will agree with that. My research shows that about 3/4 of contact center managers I've talked to will maintain some kind of a remote workforce. And that's really been driving the need for cloud-based contact centers. In fact, if you look at the quarterly results of, most of the vendors in the publicly traded contact center space, they talk a lot about having this technology move up market. So I think historically it was small businesses that were migrating their contact centers to the cloud. Now, because of the pandemic, it's larger companies. This brings up a number of migration issues. I think a lot of people, when they move to the cloud, think that these migrations are, maybe for the lack of a better term, easy peasy. But there's a lot of gotchas that can happen in that migration process. And so we're going to discuss some of those things. So joining me to discuss this, we have, two great thought leaders here. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. First, Brian Atkinson, VP and GM of EMEA at Five9. Why don't you say hello to the audience and tell us a little bit about yourself and for the few people that don't know Five9, talk about them too.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Really appreciate the introduction. Yeah, Brian Atkinson, based here in the UK. I've had a passion for CX for probably about 13 years now, and for me, it is about impacting people's lives. How do we help the day-to-day consumers of this world have better experiences? And so, yeah, really looking forward to kind of today's discussion on how we can help a lot of the businesses here, not just in EMEA, but also globally, do just that. From a Five9 perspective, global technology provider from a contact center perspective, and really seeing a lot of these trends over the last few years, as you mentioned, a lot of rapid growth over the last few years, especially in the enterprises. And yeah, looking forward to sharing what we're seeing in the industry today.
Yeah, and also joined us is Fernando Egea, Global VP of AI, which is a pretty cool title, at Talkdesk. Why don't you give a brief bio of yourself and Talkdesk?
Of course. I'm so thrilled to be here and see you, Ziaz and Brian. So I lead artificial intelligence. In particular, I lead the specialized sales team here at Talkdesk, as well as go-to-market strategy. So I get the chance to work cross-functionally at Talkdesk with all of our cross-functional teams to launch products and sell them, which is really exciting. And AI, my opinion, being the most exciting piece of cloud and, cloud contact center.
Yeah, and while it's good I think what's good having you two on, you're both based in EMEA, but I know both your companies are global in nature. I think it's fair to say that North America really led the way in cloud contact center migration, although Europe's been very aggressive of late. And so some of those best practices that you learned, out of region, you can bring in region. And so, let's take a step back and just look at CCaaS in general. I think we've introduced the topic of migrating to CCaaS, and but let's talk about why customers are migrating. So I think, as I mentioned before, if we roll the clock back pre-pandemic, the reason people were migrating to the contact center was it was just kind of a cheaper, faster way of running something that you could have run on-prem. I think what I've seen from the industry over the last couple of years is the pace of innovation of platforms like Talkdesk and Five9 has really accelerated. Right, and so now you can do a bunch of things with the CCaaS products that you couldn't do with on-prem solutions. And so, why don't we talk about some of those things? So, why are you seeing customers migrate to CCaaS? And I assume it's not this, the same old, cheaper, better, faster. So, Brian, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Happy to provide my thoughts around that, what we're seeing as well. I would probably mention kind of three kind of key areas. One, I think it's around being nimble. We can talk about what being nimble means to an organization. Second, I would say it's around kind of boundaryless access to data. In this world that we've seen over the last few years around data, leveraging that data for customer insights or quicker routing, or for multiple different things is really important. And then it's around kind of, again, the topic that we're here to discuss today, which is how does AI play into that? How can you be more nimble around, around leveraging AI, or how can you be more boundaryless with accessing data, and what does that mean to an organization? So if you look back 5 or 6 years ago, some of these things were possible, but more difficult or more costly. If you look back 10 years ago, even more so. And so I think it's just a matter of organizations, believing in the cloud now, because we've gone through that kind of pandemic period, but now embracing that that change and that shift to be able to take advantage of some of those key points. So I don't know, that would be a few of my quick thoughts. I don't know, Fernando, if you're seeing the same things from a Talkdesk perspective.
Yeah, so to bring up some good points. So at a high level, as you mentioned, as if you look pre-pandemic, companies were experimenting a lot of this innovation. And then all of a sudden, we've seen a move from piloting and testing the water to full-blown production deployments of artificial intelligence in a very short time frame. So literally, you could say that when the pandemic hit, the world really became digital overnight. Right? We're seeing this notion of omnichannel as an example. We've been talking about this forever. This is more real now than ever if you consider the number of channels that each of us use to interact with organizations. And finally, kind of the third mega trend that we see is this notion of the human, right, within automation. And it's almost an irony that in an age of automation where anything that can be automated is being automated, the role of the human being and the specific traits of humans, such as creating empathy, is now more important than ever. So I'll call this the AI first, the digital first world, has truly created tremendous challenges, but also tremendous opportunities. And from a Talkdesk perspective, we use the framework that we call the jobs to be done framework. So it's almost like you identify the biggest pains that exist. And to Brian's point, those are some of the same pains we've tried to deal with for a long time. The difference now, as you mentioned, with cloud and artificial intelligence, not only we can solve them faster, we can solve them cheaper, but we actually solve them better and at scale. So job to be done number one is how do you identify the reasons your customers contact you? This is easier said than done, knowing that only 1% of every recorded call gets properly analyzed. Job number two is how do we increase self-service automation and provide a convenience to the customer that works while reducing costs? And job to be done three is how do we empower the agents, right? The human piece to be able to resolve cases faster, more correctly, more consistently, and more delightfully.
Only 1%, huh? That's as a person that calls a lot of contact centers, I fly a lot, stay at a lot of hotels. That's very disappointing to hear. Now we are here to talk about more than AI, though, and I do think kind of an interesting pivot that I've seen here over the last few years is that I think if you think about it from an enterprise standpoint, especially 4 or 5 years ago, people would have thought it was risky to move to the cloud. I think you could argue with the rapid innovation of cloud platforms, it's actually risky to not move to the cloud, because I think you'd be your company might be, getting behind where your competition is now. With that being said, as companies move to the cloud, I know both of you have seen a lot of different deployments. What are the areas where you see companies stumble in the migration? I think there's obviously training issues, there's data migration, things like that. But what are those top 2 or 3 issues? And Fernando, why don't we start with you here?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you mentioned that perception that cloud being riskier. In fact, it's quite the opposite, as you said. And the question that companies need to ask themselves is, what is the risk and the cost of doing nothing, right, of the status quo? And arguably today, more than ever,
doing companies nothing sometimes, right? But you're right, there is a cost to it.
There is a cost, absolutely. And it's quantifiable in many cases, right? You can quantify it. And more than ever now, if you're not utilizing those innovations to improve customer experience and reduce costs, you're putting your company at risk because your competitors might be doing it, right? And kind of leapfrogging you from a competitive advantage standpoint. So with that said, I think if you look at the challenges, one of the challenges that I see, which is the one that doesn't get talked about too much, because I could approach this question from, hey, there's complexity in integration, complexity in how you migrate your existing data sets and all that. But one of the challenges that people don't talk about a lot that AI addresses is the whole notion of people involved in technology, particularly the agents. So if you consider historically, contact centers and call centers used to do, the same thing a million times. Right? Nowadays, what's left over after that digital automation, the artificial intelligence, are the more complex questions, right? They're kind of the more difficult questions. So arguably, agents are now dealing with 1 million things at the same time. So how do you then shift the focus to the people, not only to empower them to resolve those cases faster in a digital AI world, but also the whole notion of what role do humans and agents play in the age of automation, in the sense of, how do you reduce bias? How do you increase productivity? How do you get agents to actually embrace the technology? There's this perception, right? And I think, to a large extent, it's a misperception that AI is taking people's jobs. We don't see it this way. We see that artificial intelligence and humans together will always deliver the right experience. So how do you leverage the technology to upskill and reskill your people? It's kind of one of the challenges that doesn't get talked about very often, but it's one that's real, right? It could derail. Like there's this saying that culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And that's what we're talking about. You need to address the people side of the equation as being equally as important as technology.
How about you, Brian? Where you've seen a lot of deployments in your time, right? So what are some of those stumbling blocks where you see customers having?
Yeah, I love that notion that sometimes it's riskier not to move. I think that's a really key point. But I also like something that I've been seeing is that a lot of customers try to go like for like, and what I mean by that is like, hey, our practices and principles that we have going today, in the on-premise world, it works. We've got good enough CX. Like, let's just take that and go like for like, and that to me is a risky business proposition as well. Because I think if you look at the opportunity that a company has, an organization has to be able to transform, also to take a look at if you think about some of these organizations, we've had the biggest increase in enterprise customers, the 1,000 seat, the 2,000 seat, the 5,000 seat customers over the since kind of the pandemic. And you look at the heritage that they maybe have, in some of their old on-premise platforms of 10 or 15 years of configuration. There's a lot of risk in that. So the ability to go in and gain some really solid insights of what the platforms have configured today, what call flows customers are really using, maybe listen to some voice of the customer, understand really good feedback, and start to leverage. So start to simplify the configurations. Again, whether this is a 5,000 seat organization or a 5 seat organization, like simplicity is important. Taking out some of the old configuration that was there, but then thinking how can we go not like for like and be able to leverage the power that the cloud gives you. Yes, as Fernando and you mentioned earlier, it is a lower cost in some areas, and yes, it does provide remote working, but being able to leverage the APIs and the multiple services that an open cloud platform gives you, that's where we start to see that. So for me, I would kind of summarize it in, not thinking like for like as you start to migrate from your on-premise world to the kind of the cloud, and that's a really solid challenge. I would tell to anybody that's listening to this today, to kind of challenge yourself of as you look to migrate, what would that new world look like for you?
Yeah, let's stick with that theme, Brian, and I want you to kind of double click on that because I have noticed that whenever, and I don't care if it's CCaaS, UCaaS, all the way back to whenever even to the development of PCs, right? Whenever we deploy new technology, there's this urge to make the new technology look like the old technology, right? What was the first Windows app? It was a mainframe emulator, right? Because we wanted our Windows machine to look like mainframes, right? And so how do you help companies kind of break that mold and understand that there's a better way of running a contact center and get rid of that legacy mindset? Because let's be real, contact center agents, very methodological in their jobs, right? They almost work the process sometimes. And when you bring in a whole bunch of new things, you upset that process. And so how do you drive innovation without actually putting CX at risk because there's so much new stuff they have?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and Fernando hit a little bit on that. It comes down to the people inside of the organization and their desire and willingness to move, and you can't move an entire organization at once, right? You have to have champions that believe in customer experience, and first and foremost, companies like Five9 or companies like Talkdesk, we need to understand, what is that customer's business strategy. First and foremost, what are they trying to achieve? Second, how does that customer experience strategy then align to, to support that business strategy? Because some organizations, may be all about low cost of service, and high volumes of self-service. Some people, some organizations may align differently. So it's really about understanding that. Once you do that, you need to find out who those champions are inside the business. So if you're listening to this today and you happen to be one of those people that say, hey, I could actually make an impact to our business strategy or our customer experience strategy, let us help you figure out how to drive that innovation inside of your organization. So this could start off with something as simple as doing kind of a model office, for example, right? So as you start to roll out, you take a group of organization to gain the buy-in of the technology and the way things operate, and getting internal champions, show that how that relates back into the business strategy, and show that this enhanced capability is actually going to deliver better business results. So just one perspective on that. I know Fernando, you and I have worked together in the past. I think you probably would agree with some of those types of scenarios as well, right? So
you do need that internal champion, and I want to, as we pivot back to Fernando, I want to switch it up a little bit here, talk about AI. I know that's an area you do a lot of work in. I have seen some disastrous implementations of maybe not AI, but certainly of bots, right? Companies using things for the wrong purposes. And there's two sides to the AI coin, right? There's AI that can enable bots to be smarter, and then there's AI that can enable people to be smarter. And a lot of times I see companies trying to use bots for complicated things, and I think this gives kind of a perception of AI that it's not really ready for prime time. Because people were using it for the wrong purposes. And so how do you help your customers understand what's possible, where they should use it, where they shouldn't use it, and how to kind of integrate it into what they're doing now? So again, to Brian's point, you want to make sure that your CX, the customer experience, stays high, right? But AI is kind of a funny thing, and that can do wonders or it can actually hurt your brand.
I love this question.
Yeah.
So, and this is frankly a conversation that we have with customers often, believe it or not. I'll give you an example, but the reality is that a lot of those bot projects are failing. They are failing. And the good news is that we know why. So here at Talkdesk, we're focusing on turning that potentially frustrating automated experience into one that's delightful. In fact, if we do this right, the automated experience can be as delightful, if not more delightful, than one without automation. So I'm going to give you an example, and it's a real life example. We had one of our customers last week. It's a fresh conversation, and in talking to them, first thing they said is, "I don't believe you guys, because we've had a previous chatbot implementation, and it was a disaster, and he couldn't understand even the basic things. This was a bank, right? He couldn't understand a basic intent such as loan, right? The customer wanted to check the status of their loan." And we said, so tell me more about it. And then we discovered that it all goes back to kind of the key reasons, the sources of failure. And then we told them how we address this in the AI world, where first of all, you do educating that AI, artificial intelligence, is not magic, right? There's people behind AI. In fact, you can even summarize that the AI models are only as good as the people behind them. Right? It's only as good as the data you feed into the model. The problem is that data is always changing. The world is always changing. People speak in different languages. They were talking about a chatbot, but also a voice bot implementation as an IVR replacement. And we asked for examples, and they said, and this is kind of funny, they said, we our customers, and this was a bank in the Deep South, they will mention certain words with an accent, such as if they want to check their checking account, they would say like checking account, right, with an accent. And I said, gotcha. So let us show you how we train the model so you can understand local accent. And we set up an environment for them, like sort of like a mini POC environment, where we let the customer call into the bot, and we let the bot fail because they actually used the accent and the bot couldn't understand it. Fall back to the agent, said, I'm going to transfer you to an agent. Then we went into our model we call the AI trainer. It's a human in the loop technology where you can identify the hand-handled intents. That's a technical term. And we bias that model. So every time somebody says checking account, when they refer to checking account, now the bot understands the local accent. And we had them call back again. And the second time the bot picked up the accent and succeeded, right, and provided the information they wanted. They were blown away. But I think part of it is by educating people of how the technology works. And the other part of it is what Brian said. And you're right, we worked together for so long, right? They always go back to the business strategy. So I'm actually Brazilian originally. There's a saying in Brazil that I'm going to try to translate in English. If you don't know where you're going, no road is going to take you there. I don't know if that makes sense, but it goes back to the plan and it aligns back to the strategy. So what is your strategy? If your strategy is to reduce costs, then go heavier on the self-service automation front. If your strategy is to create empathy, right, which arguably should be part of everyone's strategy, then make sure you're empowering the agent.
Yeah, I've always thought about this as, maybe my thought was a little too simplistic, that, first use of AI, especially bots, should be, for things that are high frequency, low complexity, great for a bot. But anything that's a little more complicated or less frequent, have that go to a person. But even with that, the AI can help people out. And so, but you help me add some things. How about you, Brian? What are your thoughts on kind of AI? Or are you seeing people use it right, use it wrong? What are some best practices around it?
Yeah, I think a few of the things that we've seen, I think it's over the last 5-6 years, it's been very siloed use cases. And that can be good and bad, right? Siloed use cases can be very practical. So one of the key things I would say is, think about how practically you can enable maybe a moment of truth or a point in the journey for your customers and leverage AI for that, right? That gets some quick wins and make things very successful. The time that a siloed implementation is bad is, again, going back to Fernando's point and your point as well around omnichannel and the different channels that are out there. There's been so much investment in the last few years around the digital space that we've seen a lot of really good use cases come out there. I love that Fernando's talking about the voice aspect because we're seeing the growth tremendously on customers adopting newer technologies around natural language and voice recognition. And so the voice space, if you think about today, one of the worst experiences that still exists in a contact center typically is the IVR. And so we're seeing a lot of our customers go down the path of saying, okay, let's, again, going back to that, let's not go like for like, let's go away from the traditional DTMF touch tone IVRs, move into engines, that can process and natural language in a much more cost-effective way than we could even 2 years ago, let alone 10 or 15 years ago. Leverage AI behind the scenes to make sure that we're doing things like understanding, so that we're doing some more intelligent routing of where the call needs to go first. And that bot then, that's not just handling the digital channels as well, but it can also handle the voice channels, is now providing a much more holistic experience across the board. So we had some research done recently here, covered about 7 or 8 countries in EMEA and also the US, and it still showed that 51% of contacts were still on the voice side of things. And so if we take all the good things in the digital space and now apply those AI learnings and principles on the voice side of things, marry the two worlds together where it's a seamless experience, it's got to be a win-win for the consumers that are out there.
Yeah, that's been kind of an interesting, the realization through the research I've done too, is that, everybody thinks that voice is dead, right? And, I did some research where I looked at the top 3 preferred channels across all demographics. And the only one that was actually in every age demographic was voice. In fact, I had talked to the CIO of one of the mobile payment companies, and they didn't have voice in their contact center at all at first because they were targeting millennials. They thought they'd want to do everything through chat. And then he realized that when people want to talk about money, they actually want to talk to somebody, right? So anytime you have anything that gives you anxiety, you want to talk to somebody. And so that's There's a couple of good points you brought up there. As we look out in the future, though, we only have about 5 minutes left now. I do want you to help the audience think about, the future of where the space is going, right? We've had tremendous innovation. And one of the concerns I've heard from customers is innovation's almost been too fast, right? And so when you think of the old legacy contact center model, how often would you get an update to the hardware, once every 2 years or something? So bringing those features in was relatively easy. And now with the pace of innovation being so fast, release cycles are faster, training's constant. How do companies keep up with the latest and greatest so they can stay at the forefront, but not overwhelm their agents by dropping so many features on them? So I don't know if either one of you want to take a shot at that question.
I'll take a stab at this one. It's a really good question, and so this notion is real, right? Kind of this
and I don't
notion that can be overwhelmed.
Slow down innovation. That's not the right answer, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and it's the paradox of choice. So you can look it up, but it's one of the most viewed TED Talks, and it's this notion that as human beings, we think that the more options we're given, the better off we are, when in fact, it's quite the opposite. If you ask customers or anyone, in fact, to choose from a number of different options, the more options they are given, the more likely they are to choose nothing. It's the paradox of choice. So here at Talkdesk, we're focusing on making recommendations that are more prescriptive. Let me give you an example. I'm going to end with this, right? And kind of Brian mentioned the voice piece and the IVR being the single biggest source of customer dissatisfaction, which it really is. Everybody has an IVR. And I haven't found a single person in the world that says, I love this IVR. Right? Let's face it. It's an efficiency play, right? And we have IVRs because we want to optimize, not necessarily to improve. So we work with this company. It's a healthcare company, and they had an IVR which is very complex that kind of grew in sophistication over the years. And they said, "Hey, we're reluctant about adopting AI because our customer base is like more elderly people, and they're less likely to use things like biometrics and virtual agents." And we said, let us look into your IVR. And we came back with a recommendation that didn't rip and replace anything. And we gave it a name, and which was the Ai Switchboard. So the notion is, if you think about the way IVRs work today, you have to go through a number of options sequentially until you get to what you want. And sometimes you make a mistake, you have to go back, which creates frustration. So what if you could put a virtual agent on top of it and just answer customers naturally, how may I help you today, by name? And then they state their goal, and the virtual agent will then take them directly to the option they want. We call this the Ai Switchboard. And then we also give an option to use the TMF the customer wants to. So it doesn't rip and replace anything. It augments and enhances, and it creates this digital front door. Right? You only have one chance to make a good first impression. And they loved it. And they implemented it, in fact, successfully. And they transformed their experience just by doing that. So automation and containment in particular went up by 10 percentage points just a month later. Their cost went down because when containment goes up, the volume of live calls go down, and better customer satisfaction. So real life example.
How about you, Brian?
We've experienced.
How do you help your customers consume technology to the point where they're not drowning, but they're actually taking advantage of all the new stuff?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest customers here that we have in the UK, about 5,000 seats. One of the key ones that they were looking at was really about going back to the point about being nimble, but also understanding customer data. And so, if you're listening to your voice of the customer and you're understanding where those pain points are, one of the key things that you don't want to get into is massive customization across the board to where it creates a really challenging customer journey. What you do want to do is look for those areas where you can be out of the box, but you can leverage technologies again through the use of APIs, through the correct providers out there, like a Five9 or a Talkdesk, that allows you to be able to access some of those services very quickly and easily. So I would say one of the key things there is understanding the journeys that your customers are on, understanding those and identifying those pain points, listening to your customers, mapping that back to the business strategy, and then applying the technology where you see fit. But again, in this kind of customer example, the key thing really for them was out of the box type solutions where you're not spending millions of dollars developing the solution, but you're actually leveraging out of the box solutions that provide easy access to again, all of the data that's out there that exists in the world today from an API perspective.
Yeah, more and more companies I've seen trying to move to that model too of leveraging out of the box, because it's just the amount of custom integration that went into these legacy contact centers was almost overwhelming. So anyways, guys, I'm shocked 30 minutes went by as fast as it did. I do think this is a topic we could probably do 2 hours on contact center migrations. But I guess the good news for customers is more innovation's coming. So if you think you've seen innovation over the last 2 years, I think you haven't seen anything yet. And I know you two companies have done a great job of driving the industry that way. But you do have to, I think to Brian's point, listen to your customers. That's a key point that I think often companies don't do. So on behalf of Brian and Fernando, I'm Zeus Kerravala from ZK Research. Hope you enjoyed this session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of CX Today's CX Summit. Thank you.